lesson number 2. And lesson number 2 is titled Humans versus Bankers. And the first part, I'm going to bring up the first conversation we had last week, just kind of review it a little bit, because that's essentially what we're going to be doing here. We're kind of going to be doing it in like chapters almost. And this might turn into a book one day. We'll see. And maybe we'll do something special with it. But in the meantime, we'll focus on this. So these are the use cases that we had based on the conversation last week. So emergency funds, saving for a house, cross-border payments, e-commerce, getting more later, delayed gratification, insurance funds for your health, for your dental, for your pet, no transaction fees. It's a pretty good use case for a business owner trying to cut back on the 2 or 3 or 4% that they have to pay to the merchants of the world, the Visas and MasterCards. Additional security on debt. Every Bitcoin is going to have or every mortgage is going to have Bitcoin attached to it. That's what we talked about last week. Worldwide economy, and of course, micropayments, which have been impossible before Bitcoin online. And I haven't checked yet, but I'm sure some people have been zapping the show over on Nostr, maybe even some to Arnie Boy's wallet there, the QR code on screen. But that's an example of a micropayment. Because if somebody wanted to send me 5 cents worth of value, it's impossible to do in the traditional fiat system that we live in here. But it's very possible in Bitcoin. And that's what happens here every day. So that's kind of what we're going to be going through for the first chapter here. We're going to be taking a look at these different use cases. And part of the humans versus bankers is going to cover a few of these different boxes here. So let's get her started. Let's take a look at this. This is kind of the timeline of what we've gone through in terms of our financial system and our money for the last 111 years. So you see the first one there. I threw that one in there because it's very relevant. And I know we all know the Hollywood story of the Titanic and everything that happened there, but there was a little more that actually happened. And I'm not going to get too far into it because I don't want this 88 lessons to turn into a conspiracy show. But I want you to do a little bit of your own digging and see, look at the timeline there. Look at 1911, the Titanic hit an iceberg. Who was on the ship? What was going on in the background there? Who was on the sister ship? Who bailed on the trip last second? Who was for central banking? Who was against central banking? And you can maybe tie a few dots, connect a few dots on your own. I'm not going to do that here for you, but I do think it's extremely relevant because that's kind of what kicked everything off in terms of the breakdown of society. And I really want to just start there because I think that that's the most important part, probably of this whole series that we're going to be doing, the 88 lessons, is that at the core of everything here, you could point to any single issue that we see in society right now. At the core of that is the fact that other human beings have the ability to create money out of nothing. They have the ability to create dollars with zero energy required. That's a problem. And we're going to talk about why that's a problem here. But let's go through the timeline here. So 1911, the Titanic. 1913, 2 years later, was the creation of the Federal Reserve. And we should say a couple different things on the Federal Reserve. I think most people are kind of aware of what it is nowadays. I think if we went back about 10 years, nobody would have any idea, me included, what the Federal Reserve is, what they do, what the purpose of them is, what they have the ability to do. And so that was 1913 when it was created. There's a little place called Jekyll Island in Georgia, I believe, where that was formed. And so the Federal Reserve, it essentially gave humans the ability to create money. It took a lot of years for them to get to that point, but that was kind of the kickoff of it. And the Federal Reserve itself is not federal. They're not part of the U.S. government. They don't have any reserves. All they have is zeros in a spreadsheet of who owns what and who owes who. And the other part of that too is that they actually haven't been audited for 112 years since they came into existence. Nobody's thought to audit them. Nobody's asked for them to be audited before. And so when you just think about it from a very high level perspective there, when you have a starting point that's broken, right? If they've never been audited before, they tell us the M2 monetary supply is this. or the money circulating dollars in the economy is this. But we just kind of have to trust them. That's the whole issue with this. That's the whole point of this, is we have to trust them. They've never been audited before. So we're basically starting with a broken ruler. So everything from that point, from 1913, has essentially been a lie. Unless, of course, you believe them. But I don't think too many people watching this would have a whole lot of faith in somebody who has the ability to create money out of nothing. I don't. So that went on for a couple decades. We had a couple world wars there that might have played a part of that. I don't know. I'm not going to say one way or the other. But then we had 1944, the Bretton Woods Agreement, where I think it was 4 countries from around the world decided that all the currencies, every country, is going to be anchored back to the US dollar. And that US dollar is going to be convertible to gold. So in a way, it was actually pretty smart of them to do that, because who wants to carry around an ounce of gold? I shouldn't say it was smart, but it was logical. And fiat dollars aren't all created equally. And fiat dollars even had more value when they were actually paper and coins than they do today as digital money. So basically, they pegged it to gold, made it convertible to gold. Everything was pegged to the US dollar. So every Chinese yen, Russian ruble, Canadian dollar, everything was going to be pegged back to the US dollar. That's where all the exchange rates come from. But the US dollar at that time was still convertible to gold. And that was also the creation of the IMF and the World Bank. 2 pretty suspect organizations, we'll call them. That's a pretty nice way to put it. 1971, though, this is the big one. This is where everything changed in the world. Not just in the US, but in the world. Because remember, all these currencies now are anchored to the US dollar, which at this time was convertible to gold. And I would say, even as somebody who's all in on Bitcoin right now, I would say that even if we lived in a world where this was still the case, where all these currencies were still actually backed by gold or convertible to gold, things would probably be 1,000 times better than they are today. But there's also problems with gold, and we're going to get to that at a future lesson here. But the biggest one is you actually have to trust the banks, right? Because if you go and deposit amounts of gold and they give you some paper to pass around, you want to make sure that that gold that you put in there, the balance that you have in your account now, that gold's actually there. So with that comes an element of trust. Unless you have a live cam looking at that safe with your ounce of gold that you deposited there, you are relying on somebody else's trust. And that's essentially where trust broke down here in 1971, because a couple different countries said, hey, you've been funding all these wars. I think it was the Korean War, maybe at this time. I could be wrong about that, but there was a war. And certain countries said, hey, US, we don't think you have the gold that you are claiming to have. We want it back. And that's when everything hit the fan. There was another important part of this too. 1963, that's when, I think it was 63, when JFK tried making the silver dollar. And then, of course, we know what happened after that. But 1971, that's where everybody lost trust in the US in terms of them actually having the gold or not. And other countries started asking for their gold, and the US said, you know what? Before you do that, we're actually going to change things again here. We're actually going to make it not convertible to gold anymore. Sorry, suckers. But you can no longer convert your gold into dollars. It's no longer redeemable. Because, I mean, this is just speculation, of course. But I don't think they had the gold that they had claimed to. They didn't have as many dollars or as much gold as they had dollars in the economy. Because, again, this is after 3 wars or more, at least 3 wars. And what funds war? Fiat. When you give people the ability to create money, they can fund whatever they want to. And war is a pretty profitable venture. So that was 1971. We're going to look at a couple different charts here showing what happened in 1971, and even a website we might even get to, showing how society broke down in 1971. So this is the most important part of it here. This is where everything changed. For the worse, for the much worse. And, you know, at the time, I think everybody, or not everybody, some people might have seen the famous speech by President Nixon at the time. But I really don't think that people understood the implications of what he said there and what changed after that. Because slowly from 1971 on, we've seen a deterioration of society for this reason. And again, at the core of everything is the fact that human beings have the ability to create money. Not everybody, but just a small group of people have the ability to create money. And then, of course, 2008, the global financial crisis, the US housing bubble popped. Shit hit the fan once again. But this is kind of where things changed, I think, in the reverse. This is where, just like in 1971, where Nixon announced that the US was no longer on the gold standard, 2008, nobody really cared. Nobody really noticed. But the Bitcoin white paper was released on October 31st, 2008. And just like people didn't really understand the implications of 1971, most people don't and still don't, or didn't and still don't, understand the implications of the Bitcoin white paper and how much of an impact that's going to have in the world. In the opposite direction, though. Then 2009, the very first Bitcoin block was mined, January 3rd, 2009. And then, of course, 2020, where they printed about 40% of the worldwide supply total that's ever existed before. They printed 40% of the supply in the last 5 years here. And that's a pretty big deal. And I know it's kind of recent for us. We don't really understand the full implications of this, but they printed 40 to 50% in the last couple of years of the total monetary supply that has ever existed before. And so if you think about that, if you're somebody who is working, or let's say you're a baby boomer and you worked for 40, 50 years of your life and you had this nice retirement fund built up, and the government and the banks all of a sudden started printing 40 or 50% of the total supply. That means, if you think about it, if you understand the implications of printing money, that means that baby boomers essentially had about, if they worked for 50 years, they essentially had about 20 years of their life stolen. Could you imagine going to work for 20 years and the government decides to print that much money and essentially devalue your wealth, your livelihood, your energy that you spent? Baby boomers should be a lot more pissed off. The thing is, the key that keeps them happy, I think, is a lot of this inflation poured into their main asset, which is their house. And I'm going to show you a couple different assets here in terms of what happened since 1971. I mean, you don't need to be a genius to understand the implications of printing money. But let's look at the housing one first. So this is the U.S. housing price since 1900. And pretty much any chart you look at for the last 100 years, it would pretty much resemble this. Anything that's measured in fiat dollars, it would essentially look like this. And if you flipped it on its head, it would essentially look like the purchasing power of that same US dollar. So this is the US pricing for the last 100 years here. So you can see, and this actually stops in like 2020 probably. So if we had an up-to-date version of this, it would probably be off the chart. It would probably be off the screen here. But look at this. You can see for like the first 1900, 1910, 20, 30, 40, 50, it started going up a little bit. I wonder if that had anything to do with the Bretton Woods. I don't know. But then it flattens out a little bit again. And then all of a sudden right here, 1971, boom. And at this exact moment in history, this is pretty much when real estate turned from a utility asset, one that people actually use, back when people actually lived in houses. That's what this was. That's 70 years of people living in houses. Pretty flat overall. And then all of a sudden, when the US dollar was no longer a store of value, people started looking for other options. And real estate turned out to be a pretty good one here. And you can see this is when it really started taking off here. But what do I mean by that? Real estate essentially turned from a utility asset where people actually lived in the houses to a store of value asset where people just bought the houses knowing that because they're printing so much money, the value of the houses would go up in the same, correlation to that. So people started treating their houses or other houses, all real estate, now like a store of value and not as a utility asset anymore. And that's why we've seen the housing prices go up. None of these houses are worth any more than they were 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Neighborhoods aren't better. A lot of them are worse. But because they printed so much money, because people need a place to store their value. And when I say value, I mean basically when you go to work, you're working a 9 to 5 job, or you have a business and you provide products and services to the world, you get value. And after all your expenses for the year, for your business and for yourself, your rent, your gas, your groceries, all that stuff, you have some value there left over, hopefully. And you want a place to store that, because when other people have the ability to print more of that currency that you're holding, it devalues yours. So anybody holding any fiat dollars, that could be US dollars, that could be Canadian dollars, that could be Russian rubles, every time they print more money, the value of those dollars actually goes down. And that's what we're going to be talking about next week. I'm going to give a really good illustration, a very simple illustration of that. So that's why people want to store their value. They need a place for that. So that's essentially what people started using their real estate for. And look at this, same kind of thing here. This is gold, the price of gold in US dollars. So it's the same old story, right? 1900s, 1940s goes up a little bit. And then right here, 1971. So you have to ask yourself this question: did gold become suddenly more valuable in 1971? Did they change an element or characteristics in a scientific element that made it more valuable, made it more conductive to electricity, used more in jewelry, anything like that? Did anything change? No. And so it's kind of a combination of people being a little bit more educated, maybe more information about the banking system, but also just the fact that nobody wants to hold dollars. And this is pretty much a direct inversion of what the purchasing power of the dollar looks like. So it's a combination of gold becoming a little bit more valuable, I guess, with information, but mostly because the dollar has lost value against it. So you look at any chart here, and I'm going to show you another website here quickly that demonstrates this same kind of thing. And I definitely encourage everybody to check this website out, share it with your friends and your family, because it's pretty telling, and it doesn't take, again, a genius to figure this stuff out. So this website's actually called WTF Happened in 1971. I promised I wouldn't swear on here. So WTF Happened in 1971. So you can see all these different charts here, whether it's income gains, whether it's income growth. There's some good ones at the bottom here. What's this one? Real GDP per capita. Where's the other ones here that I wanted to show? A can of tomato soup. Look at that. 100 years, starting in 1895. A can of Campbell's tomato soup cost 10 cents from 1895 all the way up to about 1970 there. And this little red arrow that they have on every chart, that's 1971. That's the aftermath of human beings having the ability to print money without any effort, without any energy, and essentially deciding who wins and who loses in life. So there's more of that red arrow there. CPI. Electricity and food, look at that. Pretty stable, of course. 50s, 60s, it would be pretty much the same going back there. And then 1971 hits. Real house prices, average house prices, 1971. How long does it take to save for a house? So this is total years to save for a house. 1950, it took 2 years to save for a house. Could you imagine? Could you imagine it took 2 years to save for a house? Most people now, and again, this is another chart that ends in 2020. Most people growing up now, well, in this exact moment, will probably never buy a house. Again, going back to this isn't meant to be a doomer kind of show. It's actually showing what has happened and why Bitcoin kind of flips this whole thing on its head, and it's going to start moving the other way. So 2 years, that's what it took to buy a house. And then, of course, 1970, 80s, it went to 4, 90s, it went to 5, 2000s, it went to 7. I'm sure in 2025, it's even higher than that now. So you could pretty much look at anything here. And this is just kind of like assets. But if you look at some like food and like society related things. There is where was it? There was even chicken or something. The amount of chicken went up. The inmates, this is the people in jail, 1970, number of inmates or robbery rates per 100,000. Incarceration rate of inmates, 1971, she shoots up. So it's like no matter what you look at in society, no matter what graph or chart you're looking at, look at this. Even the median age of the first marriage started skyrocketing in 1970. Families with children. Children per women. Look at that. That's a very telling one for sure. That might be the worst one on here. 5. It was 5 children per woman up until 1970. And this only goes to 2050, and I'm sure it's like 1 less than that maybe now. And why is that? It's because families don't feel like they can afford to have kids because everything's so expensive compared to what they actually take in. It's so expensive for people to save, to buy a house, to have kids, to really have any sort of hope for the future. Growth in doctors. Look at this. This one's sickening because it goes vegetable oil, all these things. Like, look at that, 1969 right there. And if you think about it, why are the doctor visits up? Why did we switch to vegetable oil? Why? How does the money impact that? Well, with doctor visits, it's because people, they can't afford healthy food. And even if you go back to like the food production itself, if we were using the same quality of ingredients as we used in the 40s, 50s, 60s, today, a meal would cost probably $200 versus 20. So how did they keep those costs, even though everything's gone up in costs? If we were using the same quality of ingredients as we were before, they would be 10x, 20x, 30x what they are today, prices. So what do they do to keep prices down? To make it look like things aren't that bad? Well, they reduce the quality of the ingredients. And what happens when you reduce the quality of ingredients? You get sick. You need more doctors. And that ties directly with the veggie oil. Why are more people using seed oils now? Because it's cheap. So in order to keep the prices somewhat, manageable, so people aren't on the street with pitchforks, they have to do their best to keep those costs down. So when they're trying to keep the cost down, they use cheaper ingredients, like basically canola oil, veggie oil, seed oils. So that's what happens. And so the reason I called the show today, or the lesson, Humans versus Bankers, because that's essentially what's been going on. And I want to show this post here from Noster as well. But I think it's important to differentiate here, because when I say humans versus bankers, I'm not talking about your local credit union. Like, that's not the enemy here. Or even the Bank of America on your block. That's not the enemy here. I'm talking about the central bankers. I'm talking about the Federal Reserve, the people who have the license to print money. Because as the last point I want to make with this is that all these asset prices go up, whether that's real estate, the stock market, gold, Bitcoin, as all of these asset prices go up because of inflation, what happens there? The people who have assets, they don't really even notice, because their net worth are going up in the same proportion as the money printer. But what happens to people who don't have assets? Everything's still going up in price. They're making the same amount of money, and their net worth is not going up anymore. So this money printing, the Federal Reserve, the central bankers, all they're doing is they're dividing people even further. They're making the rich richer or the same, and they're making the poor even poorer. And this is happening every second of every single day. And that's why we're here. That's why we're fighting this. And that's why I don't care what side you lean politically, Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative. It's all nonsense. They're all actors. The real fight here is human beings versus the money printers. And I want to show you this post here from Michael. Banks are the biggest cancer of society because they will put their profits above everything else, above human life, funding wars. That was kind of the creation. That's why the Federal Reserve came into existence. They're above cheap and free energy, crushing and hiding inventions. They're above abundance, creating fake scarcity. They're above health funding pandemics and creating illnesses to sell more medicine. They're above innovation, protecting the monopolies and crushing competition. They're above political freedom, infiltrating our governments and financing dictatorships. They're above privacy financing mass surveillance tools. They're above free speech, controlling the narratives and the information rails. They're above mental health, funding drug cartels and cultural chaos. And they're above truth, financing and perpetuating lies. So this is the fight. This is what we're up against. And the nice thing about Bitcoin, and if you look at, I mentioned some of the banks, your local bank isn't the issue here, but there are big banks and they are a big part of the problem. If you look at how many fines JP Morgan has paid in the last 20 years for funding things like this, whether it was, I'm not going to get into it because I keep forgetting I'm on YouTube here, but JP Morgan has paid billions, tens of billions, hundreds of $1 billion in fines for breaking the law, essentially. And they consider that just the price of doing business. So that's, and the reason why Bitcoin fixes this is because Bitcoin does not have a central point. Nobody has the ability to change the supply of Bitcoin. Nobody has the ability to create more Bitcoin. In fact, the very first Bitcoin that was mined back in 2009 was done so fairly because at the time, Satoshi Nakamoto, him, they, them, her, whoever it was, I'm not talking pronouns here. I'm talking boy, girl, man, woman, or a group of men and women. But they did it fairly. They didn't have an IPO where they gave 50,000 Bitcoin to each of their friends and family or their business partners. They knew, Satoshi knew that he, her, them were the only person that could mine Bitcoin at the time. And even though 50 Bitcoin at the time was worth less than a penny, they said, you know what? We're going to start this thing from day one fair. We're going to make these 50 Bitcoin that we mined unspendable. So from the very first block in Bitcoin, everything is done fair. There's been no insiders. There's been no creation. And every Bitcoin that has been created ever since then has been created with real energy. Because in order to mine Bitcoin, you have to have electricity from the physical world. However you generate that energy, solar, wind, hydro, nuclear, anything. There's people who use old cooking oil in certain countries, use the heat from that to mine Bitcoin. But the point is that every single Bitcoin from 2009 has been mined fairly. Every Bitcoin that has been mined has been done so with real physical energy. You can't fake it. You can't just print more of it. You can't give any to your friends and family before everybody else has a chance to do it. And so Bitcoin, essentially, we talked about at the very start of the show here, but Bitcoin is peer-to-peer electronic cash. And peer-to-peer means there's no middlemen there. There's no central authority. There's no board of directors. There's no CEO of Bitcoin that you can call to complain. It's a decentralized network, and it's humans who make that network powerful. And so there it is. That has been lesson 2, humans versus bankers. That was kind of a long one. I might have to split that one up. 37 minutes. Wow. Okay, well, I got to take a breath. I want to take a sip of my coffee here that's cold now. But it's a pretty big problem. Pretty big problem, I would say.